For the artists, for the passionate. Welcome to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast. Alright, hello everyone and welcome back to the Adventures Elsewhere podcast, or welcome if it's your first time. I am your host Jade Black, and today my screen is in black and white mode because I'm talking about writing noir. So, because this is a continuation of my writing in different genres and different format series, there are a few episodes of that available now. And because these are slightly more craft-based episodes, I do like to say at the beginning, this podcast isn't about giving right advice. That's not really the point. The point is that I'm talking about my craft, my process, what works for me, what I love doing, what I'm passionate about, all of those things. A lot of this is just about observation. You know, that's the deal. So, without further ado, let's get into this. And let's talk about why noir is good to try. So, noir gets adaptations. That's the deal. There was a huge trend, I want to say a few years ago, but it was probably more than a few years ago now, for Scandi noir, particularly in the UK. It was huge for a really long time, and people still are looking for that and still really enjoy that. So yeah, if you're more commercially minded, it's worth bearing in mind. And why I love noir is because a lot of the writing process is quite similar to thriller, and I like reading noir, watching noir, I really like that, and a lot of the subject matter, but the slightly more classic, the slightly more creeping dread, it almost sort of cross with horror. I love that shit, and it's a lot of fun. So noir is something I've dabbled in quite a lot in shorts. There's a shelved writing project. I sort of had a working title of Murder and Malfeasance, which is where this drawing at the bottom comes from. And a couple of projects I'm yet to start in more of a game space. One, it doesn't really have a title, but the sort of, in my brain, it's Justice and Jazz. And the other one is Yes Dear. So noir is something I have dabbled in and thought about quite a lot in my time, especially recently. And there are some other noir things I have contacted too, for what it's worth. So common elements of noir, this comes from writing and reading and watching, so a combination of different factors. I would say one of the big ones in noir is loneliness. A lot of it is about suffering in silence, suffering alone, and that feeling that there's no one around, that you're stuck in this hole, and there's not necessarily anything you can do about it. So loneliness and helplessness together, I think, are almost the underpinnings of noir and the atmosphere of it. And depression in particular ties into that, so mental health is bound to be a theme or something that comes up across thriller and thriller subgenres. And I sort of lump noir in as well because it's so similar to a lot of it. But with noir, it's depression in particular is the one that seems to strike the most of a chord with noir, probably a blues chord, but you know, probably a nice minor seventh or something. Noir has a distinct, somber tone to it, whereas something like thriller is more of a frantic, anxious tone. I mean, there can be a lot of anxiety in noir, but there's a more somber undertone, at least, to it. And a lot of this comes from crime and organised crime. I mean, crime and noir have a lot of common ground, a lot of overlap. But a lot of noir is about people making bad decisions, rush decisions, emotional decisions, decisions through tiredness and exhaustion that end up landing them in the wrong crowd, and organised crime, and maybe the struggles to attempt to get out of that, or the descent into it, and potentially ignorance around that. But crime is a common element. I wouldn't say it's essential with noir. I'd quite like to see noir without a strong crime element to it, though I think that would be quite difficult to do without it ending up being a tragedy. But it's something I'd like to play with sometime. And because crime and organised crime is such a theme, you often end up with a lot of stuff around violence and betrayal as well. And betrayal, it's one of those things that could be a feature of just about every genre, and it's one of those things that's, I would argue, very rarely done well. It's overdone, arguably. But it's a bit more of a thing, I think, particularly in noir, and a bit more pertinent and arguably more important, because noir is a lot about testing the limits and seeing the limits that people will go to. And at some point, your main characters aren't all going to have that same line, and it might read as a betrayal when someone says, okay, I can't do this anymore. And I think that's the good kind of betrayal, when it's very character driven and it has that more stress-based motivation than anything else, and it's just about people reaching their breaking point. I think that reads a lot more naturalistically than a lot of betrayal does, but that's me. Violence is one of those things that I think is bound to come up, but I don't think you need gore with it. I think tastefully executed, maybe more subtle gore can really add to some noir stories, and I think some noir stories are probably better for it. And I think the specifics of that I'll get into a bit later. But I wouldn't say it's a necessary element, and it can be sort of off-camera, to use film term, and it can still have the same impact and still be effective. As opposed to, so the argument is really, you see, a body on page, and, the blood coming out, and the impact of that, versus this person is just gone. They've disappeared, and you know enough about what's happened to them. And both of those things are equally effective in noir, I think. Knowledge points, I would say, with noir, and I'm sure I'm going to say this every single episode. Know thy law. Know who's where, who's involved in what where the police stand on things, what they give a crap about, what they don't, and how crime and police interact, and the sort of tactics people use. That's a lot of it in noir, at least in my experience, writing it. And be consistent about that. You can get creative with it, and I think creativity with a lot of that can make really great noir, and really encourage a lot of creativity in an area like that. Although then, if you can go for a very classic feel as well, but I think that can be hard to sell in the climate that we're in now. I think with noir as well, because I feel like it's one of those genres that's inherently a bit more character-driven. Well, know thy characters then. Know what different people's breaking points are. It is a theme in noir is breaking points and bad decisions, impulsive decisions. So know what your characters would do in an impulsive light, this sort of light, and when they're exhausted. That's really, really important. And their limits. That's all really important in a genre like this. And this is a point that you probably won't hear in any other episode. Know thy beauty. Noir and film noir is beautiful. This is maybe a bit of a hot take. I think noir art and film noir is the most beautiful art there is. Full stop. And I think skipping over that and ignoring the roots of film noir and all of that aesthetic is a huge mistake. I think embracing that and really thinking about how things would look in a film noir, in a noir style, that's the shit. That, to me, and when I really started thinking about, how gore looks in black and white, and, the atmosphere of the classic Venetian blinds and the light coming through the Venetian blinds, and the sort of metal, the fire escape metal stairs, and the light coming through those, and the dimly lit alleyways, and neon signs in black and white in New York, and all of those things, and really embracing that and thinking about how it looks. That really elevated my noir. That really, really made the difference between what I felt was good noir and what I felt was really, really quite good noir. So, I talk a lot about pacing on these episodes and how time crunch is such an important thing in thriller. And because noir is thriller's neighbour, you would maybe think that the time crunch factor is huge in the same way in noir. And it is towards the climax. But a lot of noir is actually quite slow, and stylistically almost should be, and this is going back to the sort of aesthetic and the roots almost. Having things be a bit slower in noir, I would say, is the right thing to do, and I do think this is up for debate. But I think having those slow moments and embracing the aesthetic and embracing all the feel of it, as I said, I think that really elevated my noir, and it helps bring the gravity of a lot of situations to the forefront. It can really help bring out loneliness and helplessness, and it can really bring out, I think, noir's almost signature quality in just slow, horribly relentless, in the most subtle way, the creeping dread that follows you everywhere, rightly or wrongly, from the moment you wake up, when you go to work, when you're walking on the street, when you're at home in bed and you can't sleep. Everything is full of dread, and that paranoia just eats at you. And I think that happens in a way that you just don't quite get elsewhere. And I think a lot of that comes from the slowing down, the slightly longer scenes, and the slightly more indulgent vibe, slightly more indulgent aesthetic and nature of noir. I think there's a lot to be said for not even letting your foot off the gas much, but just like the little bit, it's not that different to thriller, because noir is not long, generally. Thriller is notoriously short, but noir isn't that much longer. And it is just those extensions where you embrace the aesthetic, embrace the dread a bit more. That's what sells it. So a line I sometimes drop in these episodes is, don't be shy. But in noir, I think you can get away with being a little bit more shy, particularly with gore, which I did touch on earlier, in terms of you can really go into the detail of the gore and how that bring out the dread in that, or focus more on the empty silence of the missing person, of the dead person who's no longer there. Either one of those I think works really well. And that to me is about the personal stylization of noir. You can go very literal into people's deep internal struggles and everything, or you can be, for want of a better phrase, a bit more artistic with it, a bit more subtle about it, a bit more atmospheric, I guess, about it, and a bit more symbolic. And either of those are equally effective and work equally well, and you can argue the case for that in any genre, by the way, but I think in noir, both of them carry the aesthetic very, very well, whereas in other genres, like thriller, being a bit more literal fits a little bit better a lot of the time. Not every time. But in noir, sometimes the combination of both, and you could do this by POV, you could have one that's a lot more literal and one that's a lot more atmospheric about it, and you have your cake and eat it, effectively. People to keep an eye on in noir. This is almost too obvious to mention, and it might sound stupid. The antagonist. Because the antagonist in noir is often slightly different. They're often someone that you meet face to face, and they're often someone that you meet face to face more than once, and they often have quite a lot of communication with the main character. There's a lot of psychological element there. There's a lot of that dread, and even if it's not active communication so much as just seeing them around a lot of that creeping dread, keeping a closer eye on the antagonist, not like their allies, but the antagonist, the one person themselves, I would say is probably more important in noir than almost any other genre. I mean, crime absolutely does as well, but crime and noir have so much overlap that it almost goes without saying. I don't think you get the focus on the antagonist, the one person that's the antagonist, in quite the same way in many other genres. Not without actively crossing it with noir, at least. I would say, again, a person to really keep an eye on, I did touch on this earlier, the main side character, or, secondary main character, however it's set up in your particular example, or however you want to label it, whatever. Because, as mentioned, different people have different breaking points, and exact natures of character motivations. I really want to help this person, but at some point they've got to help themselves, or there can be a lot of complexity there. And it can read like betrayal, or it cannot, or it can be understood and really beautiful. And, I know you can't take this path with me, and I wish you could, but I'm now too far down this path, and I can't stop, and a lot of that really grim, really somber stuff in noir that I absolutely fucking adore. I need more noir in my life, I really do. And because crime is such a major theme, police management and journalists are important to keep an eye on. Police management, I would say in particular in Noir, because of the injustice and a lot of corruption. Again, this happens a lot in Noir, is, okay, well, we really should be looking at this, but, you know, we got 50 grand from Al Capone, so we'll just not. That's often a really big part of Noir, and you know, how police target, you know, the easy people to put behind bars, as opposed to the real dangers and real difficulties that your main character is dealing with, and how they might try and get police management engaged, or whether they take matters into their own hands, or all of those interactions, and where the line is for the police management, depending on exactly how corrupt they are, or how swayed they are, or what they really want. That can be really key, and journalists will play a part in that, but also with the public view of, I mean, Prohibition, for example. I'm going all back to the 1920s a fair bit here, but you know, how do journalists portrayed Prohibition and people's attitudes towards that, and attitudes towards all sorts of issues around that, so gun crime and the St. Valentine's Day Massacre and all of that. And people often throw around the St. Valentine's Day Massacre as a term. I think a lot of people have forgotten, because it's easy to forget, that a massacre back then was classed as 7 people. 07. So, you know, advertising and language and all of that, that almost matters more in Noir, partly because, you know, the man in his hat with his pipe reading the newspaper is such an aesthetic thing in Noir. The newspaper almost becomes more important because it's such a key underpinning in the aesthetic. Noir is a very aesthetic genre, and a very vibey genre, and a very, very character-driven genre with a lot of rich history and classic roots, and a lot of somber beauty that I just really don't think you get elsewhere. It's quite a unique beast in that sense, while also being, you know, Thriller's sad brother. And I think Noir is probably one of the most fun genres to write, because you can be that bit indulgent and linger on those moments more than you can get away with in other genres. And also the character stuff that's the shit. If you really like these genre breakdown episodes, there's more of this available. There have been quite a few episodes uploaded already, and there will be more to come. If you've got any particular episodes you'd like to see, leave a comment, that'd be really helpful. To make sure you don't miss this, the best way of doing that, genuinely, just subscribe, and then you can check your subscriptions panel. Hey, it's all right there, and easy for you. You can just see, oh hey, Jade's uploaded today. Well, it's a Wednesday, so yeah, there you go, simple as that. The other way of making sure you know what's coming on the podcast, you know, given there's no schedule, is to hit up the home of the podcast on Instagram. On Instagram, you will get advance notice of what the episode is for the week, so you can see if it's part of the series or not. You'll also get little soundbite teaser reels and other things as and when I experiment with them. So if that sounds like your jam, that's Instagram, Jade_Black21 on there. If you're looking to know more about my writing the next time I start a noir project, or as these projects develop, or more about, you know, my other characters and what they're up to, and the spanners they're throwing at me all the time, that is Twitter, Jade_Black21 on there. And of course, if you are published or on the way, please do get in touch. I would love to be a part of your journey. You can do that via email. I'm jade42black@gmail.com. There is a list of things I want to know in the description in your initial contact. Please read that first. Couple of things worth noting. If you're indie and self-pub, you are the people I want to hear from the most. If you're trad pub, that doesn't necessarily mean I won't talk to you. Should also be noted, doesn't have to be a new release. It also doesn't have to be out yet. It doesn't have to be a particular genre, though I'd love it if you would come on and talk about noir with me. I would genuinely love that. It doesn't have to be a novel either. It can be a novella, poetry, overview of a trilogy, whatever. Doesn't have to be a particular age category. Whatever you've got, bring it in. Let's see what we can do. But until next time, you have a wonderful rest of your day. Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode, please consider leaving a like. It helps the channel a lot. Intro and outro music by me. Copyright J Black 2024.